They found it in a cedar chest sealed beneath the floorboards of a crumbling plantation house in Louisiana. An old, leather-bound ledger so stiff with age that the first page cracked apart when touched. The handwriting was fine and deliberate, the ink browned with the passing of more than a century. But it wasn't the words that drew silence to that room of researchers. It was the smell. There was a faint sweetness, like damp molasses, mixed with iron. The chest had preserved more than just paper. Between two pages lay a small scrap of linen, stained dark and brittle as old blood. Written across it, in a trembling hand, was one line. He saw them all, and no one believed. The ledger belonged to a man named Charles Ball, a former slave whose 1837 testimony would come to be known among abolitionists as the narrative of 37 Years of Captivity. But this particular copy, annotated, expanded, and hidden, contained entries no one had ever read, pages detailing sights too dreadful for polite readers of his time, witness accounts of punishment and possession, of men who vanished beneath the fields they plowed, and of a master's house said to echo with prayers that God would not hear. Scholars who first handled it thought it a forgery, but when carbon dating confirmed the ink's age, and cross-references matched Ball's known writing patterns, the horror became impossible to dismiss. What Charles had recorded was not only his own suffering, but a hidden chapter of human depravity, one that suggested the horrors of slavery reached far deeper than chains and whips. This ledger, and the stories within it, would lead modern historians to question whether the evil he witnessed was merely the cruelty of men, or something older that had taken root in the soil itself. Before we continue with the story of Charles Ball and the terrible revelations found in his lost journal, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. The air in Maryland during the final decade of the 18th century was thick with heat and unease. America was young, fragile, and already divided by the question of who counted as human. In the Tidewater counties, sprawling tobacco plantations spread across the marshlands like scars. The soil was rich and black, and it drank deeply of sweat and blood. The year was 1785. The Revolution had ended barely 2 years earlier, yet liberty was a word reserved for white men who could afford it. Maryland's laws made slavery a permanent inheritance. A child born to an enslaved mother was chained from its first breath. The Chesapeake air smelled of salt and decay, and every morning began with the same sounds: the iron rattle of shackles, the crack of the overseer's whip, and the low hymn of those who labored beneath God's indifference. Charles Ball was born into that world on a small plantation near Calvert County, where he spent his earliest years among the pine woods and fields of corn. He would later write that his first memory was not of a face, but of a sound, the clicking of a padlock closing. His mother, he said, was a gentle woman who whispered Bible verses in his ear each night, though she herself could not read. His father worked the fields, silent and broad-shouldered, and Charles remembered his voice only once, when he sang, "Swing Low," beneath a sky so dark it seemed God had turned his back. That same week, a trader came riding down from Baltimore with a list and a purse full of silver. Children fetched good prices that year. Charles was 6 when his mother was sold away, and he watched her walk down the road barefoot, escorted by 2 white men and a horse cart. She did not turn to look back, for she had been warned not to. In those years, the institution of slavery was a strange mixture of routine and terror. Plantations operated like small, self-contained kingdoms, each ruled by a master whose word carried the weight of God. Most owners were men who believed themselves civilized. They attended church, quoted scripture, and spoke of honor. Yet their hands were stained by acts that, if committed in any other setting, would have been called monstrous. Charles would later describe one such man, a master known only as Captain D, a Revolutionary veteran whose estate lay along the Patuxent River. The captain was respected among planters for his discipline and his devotion to order. He recorded every punishment in a ledger, alongside the weights of his slaves and the yield of his fields. But the neighbors whispered that the captain's fields never prospered, though his soil was fertile, that strange things happened after midnight in his smokehouse, and that no enslaved man who tried to run from him was ever seen again, not in body, nor in spirit. The world in which Charles lived was defined by its contradictions. In the small towns of Maryland, one might see a newspaper carrying speeches about liberty beside advertisements offering 2 strong Negro men for sale. Churches preached salvation but collected tithes from slave owners. Judges quoted the Constitution with one hand on the good book and the other signing bills of sale for human beings. The plantations themselves were worlds apart from the cities. In the evenings, when the cicadas sang and the river mists rolled over the fields, enslaved men and women gathered in secret clearings to pray. They spoke of deliverance, of ancestors, and of signs in the stars. To survive was to believe that somewhere beyond the darkness, freedom waited. But there were other whispers too, darker ones, of plantations cursed by the blood they spilled, of masters whose cruelty twisted their minds, and of nights when something walked the rows that was not quite human. Charles Ball's narrative, later published in fragments by abolitionists, hinted at such tales but never described them outright. His editors, nervous about credibility, stripped away the more fantastical accounts, entries where Charles described the groans beneath the ground and the black smoke that rose without fire. It was only in the lost ledger, found 2 centuries later, that those missing details resurfaced, and they painted a picture not of superstition, but of sustained, organized horror, rituals of control disguised as punishment, acts of cruelty so precise they seemed almost ceremonial. One passage, written in faint, trembling ink, described a night when Charles was 12. The master had lost a shipment of tobacco to rot, and in his rage declared that the slaves' sins had spoiled the harvest. That night the overseer assembled the field hands and forced them to stand in a circle. In the center was a hollow dug into the earth. Into it the master threw handfuls of salt and ashes, then commanded the slaves to chant verses from the book of Leviticus, verses of purification and sacrifice. Charles wrote that when the ceremony ended, the earth seemed to breathe, and by morning a new patch of tobacco sprouted where none had grown before. Whether this was delusion, metaphor, or something worse, no one can say, but the pattern repeated through his writings, the idea that human suffering could be converted into prosperity, that cruelty had become a kind of religion. The late 1700s were full of such contradictions. Enlightenment thinkers in Europe wrote of human rights, while ships from Bristol and Bordeaux ferried chained Africans across the Atlantic. American farmers attended church on Sundays and auctioned children on Mondays. The economy of the new republic depended upon the misery of those it declared subhuman. By the turn of the 19th century, Maryland's plantations had begun to diversify into grains, livestock, and domestic trades. Yet the system remained, sustained by fear and habit. And beneath the polite veneer of plantation society, there festered something Charles Ball's narrative forces us to confront: the deliberate dehumanization of a people not merely for profit, but for power. Charles himself would spend decades in bondage, sold southward, forced to work in Georgia's rice swamps, and later conscripted into the U.S. Navy during the War of 1812. His story was not just one of endurance, but of witness. He saw the institution from within every layer: the small farms of Maryland, the brutal fields of the Deep South, and the halls of government that justified it all. When we read his words today, even the censored versions, a sense of dread lingers. His descriptions of ordinary cruelty feel almost supernatural in their coldness, as though through his eyes we glimpse not just human evil, but a collective descent into madness sanctified by law. The world he inhabited was one where horror wore the face of normalcy, where a man could bow his head in prayer while a child screamed in chains, and where the soil itself seemed to drink deeply of that violence until even the fields whispered back. It is within this world, this America born of contradictions, that our story truly begins. The ledger tells us names, barely legible in the dust, pressed into paper like faint echoes. Each one belonged to someone who lived, bled, and vanished inside the system that called itself civilization. But among those names, 4 stand out: the master, the overseer, the preacher, and the witness. Charles Ball, the witness, was the quiet eye in the storm, an observer cursed to remember. But to understand his account, we must first know the figures that surrounded him, shaping the horror he would later describe. The master was Captain William D., a man forged in the furnace of revolution and pride. The overseer was a half-starved brute named Isaac Raines, whose cruelty needed no justification. The preacher, Reverend Silas Bellamy, cloaked his devotion in linen robes and scripture, but his heart was black with ambition. And then there was Charles, the young boy who saw it all and carried the memory like a wound that would never close. Captain William was a man of contradictions. Born to an English father and a Maryland mother, he had fought for the Continental Army in his youth, serving under General Washington at Valley Forge. He returned home after the war with a limp and a medal, both of which he displayed proudly. In his letters, some preserved alongside the ledger, he wrote often of the divine order of man, and how freedom must be earned by those destined to bear it. To his peers, he was a patriot. To his slaves, he was a god of vengeance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his hair gone white before his time, and his eyes the pale gray of winter skies. Charles described those eyes as cold enough to still a man's breath. The captain never raised his voice. He did not need to. His silence carried its own violence. In the evenings, when the day's labor ended, he would sit in his study beside a roaring fire, surrounded by ledgers and maps. He wrote not only accounts of his crops, but strange diagrams, circles, numbers, fragments of Latin prayers. He believed perhaps truly that the plantation was a sacred domain, a place where order and punishment reflected the will of heaven. Once, when a visiting planter questioned his methods, Captain replied, "A man must keep his house in balance. If the scales tip toward mercy, the land forgets to yield." To Charles, he was less a man than an embodiment of something eternal and merciless. He ruled through ritual as much as fear. On Sundays, the slaves were assembled for prayer, but only after they had been lined up for inspection. Any man whose back showed signs of healing was whipped again for idleness of the flesh. Charles remembered standing among them, eyes downcast, as the captain recited verses from the book of Proverbs. His voice, calm and deliberate, would echo across the field. "He that spareth the rod hateth his son. He that seeketh wisdom must be humbled before God." Then the whip would sing. If Captain Dwas the architect of cruelty, Isaac Raines was its instrument. He had once been a drifter, a man who'd fought in no war and believed in no God. He arrived at the plantation in 1792, carrying a musket, a jug of whiskey, and a scar that split his mouth into a permanent sneer. He slept in a shack near the stables, reeking of sweat and cheap spirits. Yet the slaves feared him more than the master. He seemed to enjoy their terror, often waking them before dawn just to hear the sound of chains moving in the dark. Charles recalled his voice vividly. It was low, cracked, like boots on gravel. You could hear it before you saw him, and by then it was too late. Raines rarely spoke in full sentences. His commands were short, guttural. Move. Kneel. Don't look. Once, when a boy dropped a pail of water, Rains struck him so hard the handle split across his face. When Charles tried to help, Rains leaned close and whispered, "You touch him again, I'll take your tongue for it." There was no law beyond the plantation gates that would protect them. The nearest magistrate was a friend of the captain's. The preacher, when called upon to mediate, only smiled and said, "A master disciplines as God disciplines." But even Rains, for all his savagery, had nights when fear seemed to follow him. Charles wrote that he often woke to the sound of the overseer's footsteps pacing outside long after midnight. Sometimes he muttered to himself, sometimes to something unseen. "Don't you come back," Rains would hiss into the darkness. "I buried you deep enough." No one ever asked what he meant, but the slaves noticed that each year, as the crops were harvested, one man would vanish, always at the same time, always without a word. Reverend Silas Bellamy arrived in the region from Pennsylvania, sent by the Methodist Church to minister to both masters and slaves. He was a thin man with fine spectacles and hands too delicate for farm work. To the planters he was a sign of refinement. To the enslaved, he was another mouth that blessed their suffering. He preached of obedience and divine order, of sin and submission. On Sundays, he stood beneath the great oak near the captain's house and spoke of God's mercy while the smell of burnt tobacco drifted from the curing sheds. Charles remembered the first sermon he ever heard from Bellamy. The preacher's voice trembled with false compassion. Each soul must bear the burden appointed by heaven. For some, that burden is rule. For others, obedience. But remember, our Savior wore chains too. The congregation murmured, "Amen." But the slaves did not. They simply bowed their heads and waited for the sermon to end. Yet behind that polished piety was something colder. Bellamy kept meticulous records of his visits, and among them were notes about experimentations in moral correction, rituals designed, he claimed, to cure disobedience through sacred reflection. He encouraged masters to baptize their slaves anew each harvest, believing that immersion in holy water purified not just the soul but the field itself. Captain D took the suggestion further. He began holding these ceremonies by moonlight, the water drawn not from the well but from the nearby swamp, a stagnant pool that smelled of sulfur and rot. The slaves were forced to kneel waist deep, while Bellamy prayed over them in Latin. Charles wrote that the water shimmered oddly that night, as if oil floated upon its surface. When the ritual ended, several of the slaves became violently ill. One woman died within a week. Bellamy declared it a sign of divine cleansing. The captain nodded in agreement, and Rains dragged the body away. From that day forward, the swamp was known among the slaves as the Black Pool. And then there was Charles himself, the quiet child who watched and remembered. He was small for his age, quick of hand and mind. Unlike many around him, he had a gift for observation and a near photographic memory for detail. That made him valuable to his masters, who often used him as a house servant, and dangerous to those who wished their secrets buried. In his writings, he described himself as a shadow that no one noticed. That anonymity allowed him to witness things few others survived to tell. He first learned to read from the captain's daughter, a pale, sickly girl named Rebecca, who pitied him enough to teach him the alphabet from her Bible. "You mustn't tell," she whispered one afternoon as they sat by the window, sunlight slanting through the dust. "Father says knowledge makes them restless." Charles promised, and he kept that promise for years. But words, once learned, cannot be unlearned. They become doors that never close. When he later escaped captivity, his literacy became both weapon and salvation. It allowed him to record the unspeakable, to translate horror into testimony. Yet, even then, he wrote with restraint, as though afraid that if he described what he truly saw, the words themselves might come alive. In one passage, dated 1812. He confessed, "I do not know whether the devil resides in man or man in the devil, but I have seen faces that were not faces and voices that came from no throat. If this is madness, then I have lived my whole life in the company of the mad." Charles's surviving descendants would later say that he never spoke of certain years, the late 1790s, when the plantation's misfortunes began. Crops withered overnight. Livestock were found mutilated. Rains grew increasingly unstable. And Bellamy preached that Satan walks among us in the likeness of the slave. But to those who lived under the captain's rule, the evil was not supernatural. It was simply human, concentrated, deliberate. There are no surviving portraits of Charles Ball, but his own words paint him clearly. A man with eyes like the deep woods after rain, skin darkened by years under the sun, hands scarred by rope and flame. He was a man who carried history in his flesh. He survived capture, rebellion, imprisonment, and loss. He watched friends vanish, women taken, children sold. Yet he endured, not out of faith in freedom, but out of duty to witness. He once wrote, "I was made to remember, though remembrance is the cruelest gift." When the lost ledger was finally read in full, historians noticed something peculiar. Charles often described hearing voices during his captivity, not hallucinations, but whispers that seemed to come from the land itself. He wrote of a murmuring beneath the fields at night, as if the earth were restless with the weight of buried souls. He claimed that sometimes, when the captain's punishments were most severe, the ground would tremble lightly, as though in protest or approval. Whether these were metaphors or the manifestations of trauma remains uncertain, but to Charles, they were real. He believed the land remembered every drop of blood it drank. That belief, half superstition, half revelation, would guide him through the decades of captivity that followed. It would drive him to escape, to testify, and to preserve what he saw even when no one believed him. And it would haunt him until the end of his life, when, according to family accounts, his final words were a whisper, "They're still there, beneath the fields." By the time he was 20, Charles Ball had become both participant and chronicler in a system that demanded silence. Around him moved men like Captain D, who worshipped order, Rains, who embodied chaos, and Bellamy, who cloaked corruption in faith. Together they created a world where evil wore human faces, and where one man's ledger became the only surviving testament to horrors the world was never meant to see. It is in this fragile balance of power and fear that the first signs of the deeper mystery would appear, the events that transformed cruelty into something unholy. And as Charles would write years later, "The devil does not need fire when men build their own hell." It began with the sound of digging. Late one August night in 1796, Charles awoke to the muffled scrape of metal on earth. The plantation was silent otherwise. The frogs quiet, the crickets stilled as if the entire world were holding its breath. The moon hung low over the fields, staining the tobacco leaves silver. He slipped from the servants' quarters and crept toward the noise. Behind the barn, near the edge of the woods, 3 figures worked in secret: Captain D, the overseer Rains, and Reverend Bellamy. They moved slowly, methodically, their shovels biting into the damp soil. A lantern hung from a post, its light flickering over their faces, throwing shadows that seemed alive. From where he crouched, Charles could see that they were digging not a trench, but a pit, deep and narrow, like a grave. He watched in silence, heart pounding, until Bellamy spoke. "Deeper," the preacher said softly, his voice thin against the night air. "The earth must take it wholly." Rains grunted. "Ain't right to do this at night." "You prefer the light of day," the captain replied, his tone calm but cold. "Would you rather the others see?" Rains spat into the dirt and kept digging. Charles strained to see what they buried. It was small, wrapped in burlap, no larger than a child's bundle. When they finished, Bellamy knelt beside the pit and murmured a prayer that Charles could barely hear. Words not from the Bible, but something older, harsh, and broken by pauses that made no sense. Then the captain poured something into the hole, thick, dark, glinting in the lantern light. Blood, Charles realized. A bucket of it. The smell hit him then, metallic and sour. He gagged, his foot slipping against a root. The lantern's glow swung toward him. "Who's there?" Rains barked. Charles froze. The captain stared into the darkness for a long moment, eyes narrowed. Then he turned back to the pit. "It's nothing," he said finally. "The land remembers who watches." They covered the hole and left. When Charles returned to the quarters, he lay awake until dawn, trembling, certain that something in the earth was still moving where they had dug. By morning, the plantation was abuzz with rumor. A field hand named Joseph had gone missing overnight. No one had seen him since sundown. Rains claimed the man had run away, though his wife swore he would never abandon her. The captain ordered silence and doubled the patrols. But Charles knew what he had seen. He tried to tell one of the older women, Aunt Liddy, who tended the cooking fires. She looked at him sharply, her weathered face hard with fear. "You don't speak of what white men bury," she whispered. "You let the earth keep it. The soil down here got memory longer than any man's." Charles wanted to believe her, but that night he heard the sound again, the faint, rhythmic scratching from beneath the ground. Days passed. Then strange things began to happen. The dogs stopped barking after sundown. The horses grew skittish, eyes rolling white whenever they neared the north field. And once, while drawing water from the well, Charles saw that the reflection on the surface was wrong. It showed the trees bending inward, as though the forest were closing in on itself. When he looked up, the trees stood still. The slaves spoke of these things in whispers after dark. "They'd unwoken something," said old Thomas, a man with skin like leather and eyes clouded by age. "That preacher ain't right. He call on words no man should." Liddy crossed herself. "I've seen it before," she said. "Back in Carolina. Master take to spillin' blood on his land. Crops grow green as spring, but come harvest, the worms eat the roots clean. Can't feed no house built on curses." Rains, meanwhile, grew more erratic. He began drinking earlier each day, muttering about voices in the furrows. One afternoon, he struck a field hand so brutally that even the captain intervened. "Control yourself," the master hissed. "You forget who commands you." Rains glared at him, eyes red-rimmed. "You think you command what's down there," he said, jabbing a finger toward the fields. "You think you can bargain with it?" The captain's hand twitched toward his pistol, but he stopped himself. His tone was low, deliberate. "Say such words again, and I'll hang you beside your slaves." That night, Rains disappeared. They found his hat floating in the swamp, his boots half sunk in the mud. The captain declared him drowned. No one searched further, but for weeks after, the slaves claimed they heard whistling at night, the same tune Rains used to hum when he was drunk. Charles wrote later that from that time forward, the plantation took on a heaviness, as though the air itself were burdened by the dead. Even the white folk seemed touched by it. The captain's daughter, Rebecca, fell ill with fever. She began speaking of dreams in which the earth breathes and watches. Once, she told Charles, "I hear them singing under the ground. It sounds like the songs your people sing, but slower." He asked what the words were. She shook her head. "They're not words," she said. "They're hunger." Within a month, she was dead. The captain ordered her buried in the family plot behind the house, but Bellamy objected. "Best to lay her nearer to the field," he said, "where the sanctified soil may protect her spirit." For once, the captain refused. "My daughter rests with her own." Still, he did not speak her name again. Charles never forgot the day of her funeral. The sky was clear, yet thunder rolled in the distance. As they lowered the coffin, the ground shuddered, just once, like something deep below shifting in its sleep. That autumn, the harvest was unnaturally abundant. The tobacco grew taller than men, the corn thick and golden. The captain called it divine reward and held a feast to celebrate. Even Bellamy returned, his sermons now filled with triumph. "The Lord blesses obedience," he proclaimed, voice echoing through the fields. "The wicked fall away, and the righteous prosper." But the slaves were silent. They had seen the faces of those fallen away. Joseph, Raines, the fevered girl. And now, in the light of the bonfire, Charles thought he saw something else, shadows on the ground that did not match their owners. He blinked, and they were gone. That night, Bellamy approached him as he carried firewood to the kitchens. The preacher's smile was thin, his breath sour with wine. "You're the clever one," he said. "I see it in your eyes. You keep your silence well." Charles said nothing. Bellamy leaned closer. "Do you know why the master prospers? Because he understands what others fear. Blood feeds the earth. Always has. Cain's curse is the farmer's blessing." He laughed softly, patted Charles's shoulder, and walked away. That was the night Charles decided he would run. The attempt came 3 weeks later, on a moonless night. He slipped away from the quarters, barefoot, carrying only a crust of bread and a small knife. He moved through the fields, heart racing, every rustle in the grass sounding like pursuit. When he reached the edge of the swamp, he paused. The water glimmered faintly under the stars. He remembered the baptism ritual, the stench of rot, the shimmering surface. He stepped in. The water was cold as bone. Each footfall sank deeper into the mud. Then, from behind, came a whisper. "Charles." He froze. The voice was soft, female, Rebecca's voice. "You can't run from it," it said. "It knows your name." He turned, but no one stood there, only ripples across the black water. He ran then, stumbling through the trees, branches tearing at his clothes. Behind him, the swamp gurgled like something breathing. When dawn came, he found himself miles from the plantation, half crazed with fear. But before he could reach the road, a patrol found him. 2 men on horseback. They beat him, chained him, and dragged him back. The captain said nothing when they threw him at his feet. "You've seen too much," the master murmured finally, "and too much seeing is a dangerous sin." That night they locked Charles in the smokehouse. Through the cracks in the wall, he saw Bellamy arrive again, carrying a small brass bowl. Inside was something black and viscous. Bellamy dipped his fingers into it and drew a mark upon Charles's forehead. A circle crossed by 3 lines. "This will keep your tongue still," he whispered, "and your memory pliant." When Charles woke the next morning, the mark was gone, but his dreams were not. He began to see faces in the grain of the wood, hear voices whispering beneath the wind. The plantation had become a place outside time, where the living and the dead shared the same air. He could not tell if the horror was within him or around him. But he knew one thing. The ground beneath those fields was no longer just soil. It was a mouth, and it was waiting to be fed. And so began the slow unraveling of everything: faith, sanity, and the thin line that separated cruelty from something darker. The missing grew more frequent. The fields grew richer. And every night that same sound returned to Charles's ears, the scraping of shovels in the dark. What had started as one man's punishment had become a ritual, a covenant between masters and their land, sealed in blood. But the truth of it, the revelation of what they had truly awakened, was still to come. What do you think? The narrator's voice would ask the viewer here, low and deliberate. Guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. Because soon, Charles Ball would learn the answer for himself. And what he found beneath that earth would change everything. By 1797, whispers had spread beyond the plantation's fences. Travelers passing through Calvert County spoke of strange fires seen at night, of fields that glowed faintly under the moon. Farmhands on neighboring estates swore that smoke rose from the property even on windless evenings, and that no bird sang in the trees above those acres. But in the daylight, everything appeared ordinary. The tobacco leaves shimmered in the sun. The captain's ledger showed record profits. And in the small white church on the hill, Reverend Bellamy preached of obedience and prosperity, his voice as smooth as honey. Only those within the walls of that plantation knew what was truly happening. Charles Ball, scarred, quieter now, but still watching, felt it first, the change in the air. The smell of iron and salt clung to every breeze. The soil underfoot was darker, richer, as if newly fertilized. The slaves no longer spoke of escape. They moved like ghosts through the rows, their eyes dull, their songs silenced. The captain had instituted a new ritual that spring. Each Sunday evening after prayers, the slaves were gathered in the north field. There, Bellamy would read from a small leather book that was not the Bible, its pages filled with cramped Latin script. The captain stood beside him, his hands clasped behind his back, and Rains, a replacement, a young overseer named Caleb, carried a whip but rarely used it. At the end of each service, Bellamy poured a libation onto the soil, a mixture of water, ashes, and what Charles recognized by its smell as blood. Cleansing the earth of corruption, Bellamy would say, renewing the covenant of order. But the earth, Charles wrote, no longer took such offerings quietly. Sometimes, as Bellamy poured, bubbles rose from the ground, thick and oily. The slaves flinched, but no one dared move. And when they dispersed, their footprints left dark stains that did not dry. The captain's temperament shifted as the harvest approached. He grew withdrawn, pacing his study late into the night. Charles, who still served him meals, often found his employer staring at the fire, muttering half-prayers to himself. One evening the captain asked, "Do you believe the soul of a man can bind itself to the land?" Charles hesitated. "I do not know, sir." The captain nodded slowly. "It can," he said. "I have seen it. This soil remembers its masters. It rewards the faithful and punishes the disobedient." He smiled faintly, eyes distant. "Even the dead serve purpose here." Charles's hands trembled as he cleared the table. "Yes, sir," he whispered. The captain continued, more to himself than to Charles. "Bellamy says it's not sin if the land demands it. That to feed it is to honor what gives us life." He looked up suddenly, fixing Charles with that cold, gray gaze. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" "No, sir." The captain studied him for a long moment, then said quietly, "Good." That same month, a storm swept through the region, lightning without rain, wind that carried the scent of sulfur. When it passed, the plantation well ran foul. The water turned black. Bellamy claimed it was a trial of faith, that they must draw from the swamp again until the Lord restores purity. The captain agreed, but the slaves knew better. Aunt Liddy spat on the ground. "Ain't the Lord's work," she hissed. "That's the devil's spit, and they drink in it like wine." 2 men fell ill soon after. Their skin grew ashen, their eyes sunken. They spoke of nightmares where they were buried alive, surrounded by whispers. One morning they were gone. The captain's men said they'd been sent to another plantation. But Charles found a patch of fresh soil near the north field, damp and uneven. He knew that ground. He knew the smell. In town, people began asking questions. A merchant who supplied the plantation with salt and molasses noted that the estate had stopped purchasing food for its slaves. "Strange," he told the local magistrate. "They're feeding more mouths than ever, but buying less than half what they used to." The magistrate shrugged. "If the crops are good, the Lord provides." But not everyone was so dismissive. A local physician, Dr. Ephraim Hall, who'd treated the captain's daughter before her death, rode out to the plantation one afternoon to collect payment. He found the captain pale and distracted, his hands trembling slightly. "You're unwell, sir," Hall observed. "Perhaps I might examine you." The captain forced a smile. "No need. The sickness here is not of the flesh." Hall frowned. "And your workers? I've heard rumors. Fever, wasting." "They're disciplined," the captain interrupted. "Not sick. Discipline is a kind of cleansing, Doctor. Sometimes the body must weaken before the spirit grows strong." Hall stared at him. "You sound like Bellamy." The captain's expression hardened. "Then perhaps Bellamy is wiser than you think." When Hall left, he noticed something in the fields, a scarecrow, newly erected, clothed not in rags but in a faded blue uniform coat. The face beneath the straw hat was disturbingly human-shaped, the hands too real. That night, Hall told his wife he would not return there again. Charles's fear deepened when he began hearing the children crying in his dreams. He wrote later, "I do not know if they were living or dead." The cries came from beneath the ground, soft at first, then rising as though they begged for air. One night, he woke to find the floorboards damp, his blanket soaked through with cold moisture. The scent of the swamp filled the room. When he stepped outside, he saw mist rolling across the yard, not fog, but smoke that clung low to the earth. It moved against the wind. And within it, faintly, came that same whistled tune rains used to hum. In early autumn, Bellamy arrived again, this time with two strangers, men in long coats who spoke with the clipped northern accents. They carried with them crates of glass jars and a copper basin engraved with unfamiliar symbols. Charles was ordered to assist them. Inside the captain's barn, he saw the basin placed on the floor, surrounded by chalk markings, circles intersected by lines. The men filled the basin with a mixture of water and ashes. Then Bellamy added something small and gray. Bones. Human bones, by the look of them. The preacher's voice was calm, deliberate. The covenant must be renewed in full. The harvest demands remembrance. Charles dared to ask, "What is it you do, sir?" Bellamy looked at him with faint amusement. "We give back what was taken. Every master must pay his tithe, every servant his due. The land is older than our God, boy. It must be fed." He motioned toward the captain. "You will see wonders before the night ends." Charles tried to flee, but Bellamy's men blocked the door. "What happened next?" he wrote. "I scarce believe even as I recall it." Bellamy began to chant in Latin, his voice rising in cadence. The captain knelt beside the basin, dipping his hands into the dark mixture. As he did, the liquid thickened, pulsing like a living thing. A faint hum filled the air, low and steady, vibrating through Charles's ribs. Then, impossibly, the basin began to move. It shifted across the dirt floor, leaving a wet trail, as though drawn by an unseen force. The captain gasped, gripping its edge. The humming grew louder, until Charles could feel it in his teeth. And then it stopped. The basin stilled. The men stepped back. Bellamy smiled. "It is accepted." When they left, Charles saw that the ground beneath the basin was scorched black, and at the center, pressed into the dirt, was the outline of a human hand. Days later, one of the new field hands, an older man named Moses, collapsed while harvesting. Charles ran to help, but when he turned the man over, he saw something carved into his chest, the same symbol Bellamy had drawn on the floor of the barn. Moses lived just long enough to whisper, "It's in the ground now, in the ground," before his eyes rolled back and he was still. The captain ordered his body burned. When the slaves gathered to watch, Bellamy intoned a prayer, but the flames burned cold, smokeless, blue, and silent. Soon, the townspeople could no longer ignore the rumors. Livestock on neighboring farms began dying without cause. Cows found drained of blood, horses refusing to cross the property line. The local sheriff rode out once, returning the next day pale and trembling. He resigned his post a week later, telling friends only, "There's things out there a man's badge don't protect him from." By winter, the plantation was isolated. Only Bellamy came and went freely, his sermons now tinged with manic joy. "The covenant is complete," he told the captain one night, unaware Charles was listening beyond the door. "The earth is reborn, and your name shall endure as its keeper." The captain replied, "And the cost?" Bellamy smiled. "The cost is always the same, a portion of what you claim to own." That winter, 3 slaves disappeared. No one spoke their names. Charles wrote that by then he had ceased to believe in salvation. "The world had become a wound," he said, "and we were the blood that would not stop flowing." The nights grew longer. The fields glowed faintly with a sickly light. Once, Charles swore he saw figures moving beneath the soil, as if the earth itself were shifting in its sleep. He prayed, not for deliverance, but for forgetfulness. And yet, he remembered everything. In March of 1798, something changed. The captain fell ill. His skin turned gray, his eyes sunken, his hands shaking violently. He refused a doctor, insisting it was a necessary trial. Bellamy visited daily, chanting over him, sprinkling ash and blood across his bed. Charles tended to him during those days, witnessing the slow unraveling of a man who once commanded armies. One night, the captain grabbed Charles's wrist with surprising strength. "It wants more," he rasped. "The land, it whispers now, says I must finish what was begun. Says it's hungry." Charles tried to pull away. "Sir, please." The captain's eyes rolled white. "Bring me the ledger, the one beneath the floor, quickly." Charles hesitated. "Do it!" the captain roared. He obeyed. When Charles handed him the old cracked book, the captain clutched it to his chest and whispered, "It's all written, all promised. I only followed the covenant." Then he began laughing, softly at first, then louder, until the sound echoed through the house like something unholy. By dawn, he was dead. Bellamy performed the burial himself. No priest, no witnesses. Only Charles, standing at a distance, watching as the preacher lowered the body into the north field. That night the ground trembled again. The plantation did not die with its master. Bellamy took control, claiming the captain's will named him overseer of all property. The slaves were forbidden to speak of their former master or the rituals. But the land did not forget. Within weeks, the fields began to rot. The corn withered. The tobacco turned black on the stalk. The air grew heavy with the stench of decay. Charles wrote, "It was as though the earth itself had grown sick of what it had swallowed." And still Bellamy persisted, conducting rituals more openly now, calling them services of renewal. He made the slaves dig new pits, larger this time, and when they asked what for, he smiled and said, "For the planting." The line between superstition and horror had long since blurred. Even Charles, hardened by years of suffering, began to believe that something inhuman had taken root beneath those fields. The sounds grew louder each night. The muffled wails, the whispers that seemed to form words. "Feed me," they said. "Remember me." Charles knew then that escape was no longer just survival. It was salvation. And when the next full moon rose, he would try again. But what he found waiting in the darkness that night would reveal the true nature of what Bellamy and the captain had done. The revelation that would turn madness into myth, and myth into terror. The horror that would come to be known in whispers as the Covenant of the Black Soil. If you stood in that room, the narrator's voice lowers here, grave and deliberate. Would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. Because the final act of this story is not about blood or cruelty. It is about what happens when men try to make gods out of their own evil. The night of Charles Ball's final escape was moonless again, just as it had been the first time. Yet the silence that spread across the plantation was not the silence of peace. It was the silence before a scream. He had waited for weeks, watching Bellamy's routines, memorizing when the preacher left for town, when the new overseer patrolled the fields, and when the others slept. But that night, none of it followed pattern. There were no hymns, no whip, no sound but the wind moaning across the marsh. Even the frogs and crickets had gone still. Charles felt the air pressing against his chest, as if the whole world were holding breath. He whispered a prayer his mother had taught him long ago, the words trembling against his teeth. "Deliver me from evil, even when it wears a crown." He slipped from the quarters and crept toward the barn. Inside, he could hear faint movement, a shuffling, like many feet dragging in rhythm. Through a crack in the wall, he saw them. Dozens of enslaved men and women, standing in a circle, their faces slack, their eyes glassy in the torchlight. They moved not of their own will, but like puppets tugged by invisible strings. In the center stood Bellamy, his robes black with soot, his hands outstretched over a mound of earth. And on that mound, half buried, lay the captain's body, at least what had once been his body. The flesh was bloated and gray, yet the chest rose and fell as though drawing breath. The mouth hung open, and from it poured a faint, constant hum, the same hum Charles had heard the night of the basin ritual. Bellamy's voice rose over it, calm and ecstatic. "You who were master, awaken. You who commanded the earth, return to your dominion. The covenant is sealed, the debt repaid." The crowd swayed. One of the women began to cry softly. Bellamy turned sharply, his voice cracking with fury. "Silence! He hears!" He lifted a knife, its blade dull with dried blood, and plunged it into the soil beside the corpse. The ground quivered and the torches flickered blue. A smell filled the air, iron and rot, the scent of something newly unearthed. Then the captain's eyes opened. Charles would write years later, "I saw a man die twice, and still he rose again. His face was no longer the face of man, but of the earth itself, cracked and hollow, with darkness behind it." The body sat upright, moving as though bones remembered motion without flesh's permission. The slaves nearest to him screamed and fled, but Bellamy shouted, "Stay, you are witness to rebirth." The corpse turned its head toward the preacher, and in a voice that was not a voice, low, deep, like wind through a crypt, it spoke. "You promised me dominion, yet you fed me ashes." Bellamy stumbled backward, his composure shattering. "Chan fulfilled the covenant." "Liar," the voice said. "You gave me not life, but hunger." The ground erupted beneath the mound, soil bursting upward like a wave. Hands, blackened, skeletal and countless, thrust from the earth, grasping, pulling. The dead were rising, not cleanly, not like spirits, but like roots being torn from deep clay. Bellamy screamed, dropping the knife, but the hands found him. They dragged him down into the soil as though it were water. His last words were not prayer, but raw, animal terror. The torches went out. Darkness swallowed everything. Charles ran. He fled through the fields, the air alive with the sound of tearing earth and whispering voices. He did not look back. The rows of tobacco seemed to twist and close around him, the leaves brushing his face like fingers. Behind him, faintly, came that humming again, no longer from the captain's corpse, but from the ground itself. He reached the swamp, lungs burning, and turned once more toward the plantation. The house was burning. Flames climbed the walls, casting a red glow across the water, but the fire made no crackling sound. It moved too slowly, too deliberately, as if the building itself were breathing flame. And in that light, he saw figures emerging from the soil, shadows shaped like men, yet hollow, their movements fluid and unnatural. They moved toward the house, merging with the smoke. Charles stumbled into the swamp. The mud clutched at his legs, but he forced himself forward until the plantation vanished behind the mist. He did not stop until dawn. When he finally collapsed beside a road miles away, a wagon driver found him, half-conscious, caked in mud, his eyes wild with exhaustion. The driver, a Quaker named Elias Turner, took him in without question. For days Charles could not speak. He would wake in the night screaming, clawing at the floorboards, convinced he still heard the humming underfoot. Turner wrote in his journal, "The colored man bears marks upon his body and soul that no mortal hand alone could make. He speaks of earth that breathes, and men who walk after death. Whether this be madness or vision, I dare not judge." When Charles finally regained speech, he begged Turner to take him north. "I'll work, sir. I'll work till I die, but I can't go back. The land there, it remembers." Turner agreed. Within weeks, Charles was on a route toward Pennsylvania, and eventually further north into New York. There, he would begin the long process of freedom, not just from bondage, but from memory. Yet, memory has its own chains. He carried the captain's ledger with him, hidden beneath his clothes, the same ledger later found under the Louisiana floorboards generations later. In it, he had written everything: the rituals, the deaths, the thing that rose from the earth. But he wrote it as one might write a confession, not a tale for others to read. The final entry, dated June 1798, reads, "The earth devours all men, yet it remembers what it eats. If God made soil from our dust, then he knows what grows from it when we forget to pray. The captain's house is gone, but I hear his voice still, in thunder, in plow, in every man who believes suffering makes him divine." Decades passed. Charles Ball built a life of sorts, working as a sailor, then as a farmer. He married, had children. He wrote of his experiences in slavery, but never spoke of the black soil again. But there were signs the past had followed him. In 1821, while living in Pennsylvania, Charles awoke one morning to find small patches of his yard turned black overnight. No plants would grow there. When he dug into the soil, the smell that rose from it was the same as that night long ago: iron, decay, and something faintly sweet. He buried the shovel and never touched that earth again. Neighbors later said he often walked the fields at dusk, murmuring to himself. When asked what troubled him, he'd only reply, "Some things grow whether you plant them or not." When Charles's account was finally published in 1837, edited heavily by abolitionists, it omitted nearly every reference to the supernatural. The editors wanted a moral narrative, a testament to human endurance, not a chronicle of damnation. Yet the censored paragraphs survive in private letters and later annotations. In one of them, Charles writes, "What I witnessed was not of man alone. The sin of slavery was not only the breaking of bodies, but the binding of souls, to field, to master, to earth. We built altars from our pain, and the gods we made answered. A century later, in 1922, a team of surveyors clearing the ruins of the old plantation discovered something beneath the weeds. A series of shallow depressions, perfectly circular, spaced in a pattern across what had once been the north field. When they dug, they found hundreds of bones, charred and fractured, arranged deliberately in rings. Among them, a single brass button bearing the insignia of the Continental Army. And deeper still, beneath one ring, a rusted basin engraved with Latin words, Dominium ex sanguine. Dominion through blood. No official report was filed. The land was quietly purchased by a private firm, the remains reburied without ceremony. But one of the workers, a man named William Holt, later told a journalist that he'd heard a low humming from the ground while they dug. Like something moving under the soil, he said, like it was breathing. The story might have ended there, another forgotten footnote in America's haunted past, if not for the discovery of the hidden ledger 2 centuries later. Inside that book, beneath Charles's trembling handwriting, lay a final page added years after his last known entry. The ink was different, the script clumsier, but legible. I found him again, in a church outside Baltimore. He wears another name now, but the eyes are the same, gray like ash before rain. He says the covenant never died, only changed hands. The page ends there. It is here that the documentary's tone lowers, the narrator's voice nearly a whisper, deliberate, haunted. You must ask yourself, he says, what does it mean when horror repeats itself? When men convinced of righteousness begin again to speak of purity, of order, of dominion? When the ground beneath us remembers every drop it's been given? The story of Charles Ball is not only one of slavery and cruelty. It is a mirror held up to the country itself, to the violence buried beneath every ideal, to the ghosts that never found rest because we never stopped feeding them. Some say the black soil remains cursed, that nothing will grow on it even now. Farmers avoid the area, animals refuse to graze there, and on windless nights, the locals claim, you can still hear the faint hum beneath the ground. Not thunder, not wind, just the land remembering. If you stood in that room, the narrator murmurs one last time, would you call it crime or sacrifice? The question lingers as the screen fades to black, the faint hum rising once more beneath the closing credits. Morning came to Calvert County as if nothing had happened. The ash settled quietly, the smoke rose, and the fields stood empty. To those living miles away, it was just another dawn in Maryland, a day for markets, sermons, and the steady hum of commerce. No one ever officially recorded the destruction of the plantation. There were no newspaper clippings, no obituaries, no memorials. The land changed hands silently. Deeds traded among lawyers who preferred not to ask questions. Within a decade, the very name of the captain had disappeared from local records, replaced by vague references to a forfeited estate. But stories travel where records cannot. By 1805, whispers of the haunted plantation spread along the coast. Sailors in the Chesapeake taverns told of a stretch of land where tools rusted overnight, where the soil bled rust red after rain, and where the cries of the buried could be heard through the plow. Local preachers warned their congregations to avoid the cursed acres of the north fields, and families crossing the region at night claimed to see fire flickering beneath the earth, as if the land itself was burning from within. Those who still worked nearby learned to keep their distance. They did not cut wood from the property or draw water from its wells. And then, silence, decades of it. The land lay fallow, overgrown with pine and vine, until time itself seemed to forget. Yet the story never fully died. When Charles Ball's narrative was published in 1837, readers across the northern states devoured it. His account of bondage, endurance, and freedom made him one of the most respected black authors of his age. Abolitionist societies printed excerpts, using his words as moral ammunition against the Southern institution. But those who knew Ball personally sensed there was something unspoken in him. His editor, a Quaker named Isaac Fisher, wrote privately, "There are nights when Mr. Ball wakes trembling. He speaks of the ground as if it were alive, as if sin itself were sown into the furrows. I have urged him to omit these passages, for no reader would believe such superstition." And so, the legend of the black soil remained buried, just as the bones beneath it were buried again and again. Yet traces of it leaked into other places, in sermons, in songs, in superstition. In the Gula regions of South Carolina, elders spoke of the hungry ground, a patch of earth that consumed the wicked and the innocent alike. In parts of Louisiana, enslaved field hands refused to work under a moonless sky, saying, "The earth walks on nights with no shadow." Whether coincidence or cultural inheritance, the echoes of Charles's story persisted across generations. When emancipation finally came in 1865, the world Charles had known was already crumbling. He was an old man by then, thin, quiet, his eyes still haunted. Freedmen who met him later described him as gentle, yet forever listening for something. He spent his final years near Columbia, Pennsylvania, where he attended a small Methodist congregation. One winter evening, a neighbor found him sitting by the fire, his Bible open, staring into the flames. When asked what troubled him, Charles simply said, "The ground's not done yet." He died a few months later in the spring of 1866. His modest grave bore only his name, the date, and a verse of his choosing: "The earth shall give up her dead." The decades that followed buried his memory beneath the tide of Reconstruction and industrial growth. The plantation lands were parceled into farms, later bought by speculators. Few ever tilled them for long. Machines broke, wells collapsed, livestock sickened. Locals said the soil was too temperamental. Then came 1922, the year of the Archaeological Survey. The men who unearthed the remains of the North Field never filed a public record, but one of them, a laborer named Holt, left behind a private letter. It surfaced decades later among his family papers. It reads, "We dug 6 feet down before the spade struck bone. Not one skeleton was whole. They were twisted, as if the ground had churned them. When we broke open the basin, a smell came up that turned the men white. One said it sounded like the sea, but I swear to you it was breathing. We filled it back, quick as we could." Holt refused payment for the job and never worked again. The company that owned the land sold it a year later. It became a logging site, then a hunting preserve. And finally, in 1954, it was purchased by a sugar conglomerate that built a refinery on its outskirts. Workers there later reported machinery failures every harvest season, motors seizing without cause, metal corroding within days. They joked that the ground ate iron. None of them knew the land's history. Or perhaps in some deep way, they did. Historians revisiting Charles Ball's writings in the 20th century began noticing inconsistencies, missing years, gaps in the timeline, and references to a field where the light never reached. Scholars debated whether these were metaphors for trauma or fragments of suppressed memory. In 1978, a historian named Dr. Miriam Doss published Soil and Suffering, The Forgotten Theology of the Slave Narrative. In it, she argued that Ball's account suggested a proto-religious system, one where suffering was ritualized into salvation and bondage itself transformed into a perverse form of worship. Her controversial conclusion was simple. In the American South, cruelty became liturgy. The plantation was the temple. Doss was ridiculed in her time, but modern scholars have since reconsidered her claim, particularly after the rediscovery of the expanded ledger found in Louisiana in 2014. That document, authenticated by handwriting experts, contained everything Charles's public narrative omitted: the rituals, the basin, the night of the resurrection. And it ended not with his escape, but with a line that chilled even the most skeptical researcher. I do not write to warn, but to confess, because what men do in the name of dominion will never stay buried. The discovery reignited debate about the legacy of slavery, not as a closed chapter, but as an ongoing haunting. Theologians called it America's covenant with blood. Historians called it allegory. But those who read the ledger in full described an emotion deeper than horror: shame, awe, and a strange sense of recognition. Because beneath every field that fed the young nation, there had been bodies. And if one listens closely enough, perhaps the land still remembers them. In the years since, researchers have tried to locate the precise site of the plantation. Maps from the 1700s place it near present-day Prince Frederick, but development has erased most landmarks. Still, farmers report patches of infertile ground, where soil remains dark and damp even in drought. They say nothing grows there, and when the wind blows over it just right, the grass lies flat as if pressed by invisible hands. Charles Ball's story is both confession and warning. His words survived not just as a cry against human cruelty, but as a record of what happens when a society baptizes its sins in religion and calls it order. The black soil remains more than a location. It is a symbol of the nation's original sin, its insistence that domination could be sanctified. It is a reminder that the earth does not forget. For every generation that believes its violence righteous, the soil waits patiently beneath their feet. It remembers the blood. It remembers the names. And sometimes it hums. Even now, centuries later, the story of Charles Ball leaves us uneasy, not just because of what he saw, but because of what it says about us. The earth he fled is still the same earth we walk upon. Beneath our cities, beneath our fields, beneath every monument to progress, lie the echoes of those who suffered to build it. Maybe the black soil was never cursed at all. Maybe it was only honest. Because the land does not lie, it remembers. It keeps its covenant long after men have forgotten theirs. So, what do you believe? Was this truth unveiled, or was it buried again to protect the powerful? Write your theory in the comments. And, if you want us to keep digging into America's darkest, most forgotten histories, like this video and subscribe. Join us next week as we open another ledger that was never meant to be read. Some stories die in silence. Others, like this one, just keep whispering.